Now we're going to talk about loneliness. And when you think about people being lonely, who do you think about? Elderly people, perhaps. Well, you would be right to a point. But in fact, loneliness affects all generations and is evident in every society all across the world. People are going to severe extremes to try and eradicate the manifestation of feelings of loneliness in their lives. And as we survive day to day during this pandemic by staying apart, what can we do to help those who feel lonely? Well, Lorena Hertz's book, The Lonely Century, is an absolutely fascinating read. And she talked to me about it recently, and she begins by explaining the different ways that people can feel lonely.
So for me, loneliness is of course about feeling that we're lacking in friendship or company or intimacy. That clearly is loneliness. But so too is loneliness about feeling that we're lacking support from friends, for sure, support from family, true, but also I would argue support from the government, our neighbours, our employer, even our fellow citizens, a sense of having to fend for ourselves in an increasingly harsh and difficult to fend for oneself world.
And I suppose, when we think of loneliness, the stereotypical way to describe it or to think about it is that it affects elderly people primarily. But as you say again and again, this is by no means exclusively. It does affect elderly people and very badly, but it's just everywhere. You can even be in a house full of people and still feel lonely at any age.
Yes, for sure. And that was one of the most striking realisations as I was writing this book, that it wasn't just that 2 in 5 pensioners in the UK, their main company is their television or pet. I mean, heartbreaking. Yeah. But it was that young people are actually the loneliest. 3 in 5 18 to 34-year-olds are lonely often or sometimes, and nearly half of 10 to 15-year-olds. Our children are lonely, and that's at a scale that is really unprecedented.
So let's go through the reasons for this loneliness, Norina, and the reasons you have defined in your book, The Lonely Century. And I suppose you've mentioned young people there. You've given a shocking statistic, which a lot of people will probably think, what? That couldn't be true. Young people can't possibly be lonely. They go to school, they go to college, they're surrounded by people constantly. But you mentioned the smartphones and social media and the digital devices, which are such a massive part of our lives at present, and how divisive they are. And just tell me how you have defined how they affect loneliness.
Yes, so I think the research is by now actually really clear that time spent on social media rather than bringing us closer together actually makes us more lonely. And there have been 2 very big, very gold standard studies done in the last couple of years that make this very clear that it is the case. Some of the reasons because they were highlighted by some of the young people I interviewed, people like Peter, the year 9 student, who told me about how alone he felt when he would post on his Instagram and then be waiting for somebody to respond and nobody responding, and him thinking, what am I doing wrong? Or Claudia, the teenager who her friends said that they were going out. It was the end of her year. Her friends said that they weren't going out and doing anything. She was scrolling on her social media, saw them all having fun out without her, and said she felt so excluded, so on her own, that she hid in her room and wouldn't go to school for a week. And I think whereas in the past, of course, there were always cases of kids being excluded, what's different now, and this is what a head teacher explained to me, and I think it was a very astute observation. Now, this exclusion, in the past, an adult would see the exclusion. So a teacher would see that a child wasn't being invited to sit with other kids at lunch, or a parent would see that their child wasn't being invited to play with others. Now, because so much of children's lives are on their screens, in their WhatsApp groups, on their social media, on their Insta, on their Snapchat, that parents, adults, teachers can't see that they are being excluded, and so they can't intervene, whereas their exclusion amongst their peers is all too obvious.
It's part of this contactless society as well that you also talk about in the book. We seem to be able to live a full life. We can have our yoga lessons or whatever it is in the house. We can do our shopping one click and it's delivered to the door. We don't have to leave the house. We don't actually have to speak to another human being. But we can lead a full life, which was handy during lockdown. It's handy as we self-isolate or as we keep our distance from people. But ultimately, the other side of this, when we come out the other side of it, it doesn't make for a very fulfilling future, does it?
No, because we've traded off convenience for community. And obviously during lockdown, we didn't have a choice. But even before that, people were buying their books on Amazon, not going to the local bookstore. They were buying their food on a food delivery app and eating at home rather than supporting their local cafe or restaurant. And this goes against everything that we are hardwired for, because we are creatures of togetherness. We are actually hardwired to connect. So in making these choices, which may be more convenient and sometimes are even cheaper, what we're forgetting is that this is going against all of our fundamental instincts.
Is selfishness one of the reasons that we are living in, as you call it, the lonely century?
I think it is. We've become as a society ever more self-absorbed, ever more selfish, me first. We've become hoarders, not helpers, takers, not givers. We've become that way partly because those were the kind of values that have been lionized and held up as the great values, partly because as a society we stopped valuing things like kindness and care. One of the things I looked at in my research was I looked at on a leading jobs site, I looked at jobs which had the word looking for people who were kind or caring or those sorts of terms. Those kind of jobs paid significantly less than other jobs. So we've been living in a world that hasn't valued, and we've stopped valuing those qualities in each other. And yet now I think we all realise more than ever the importance of being connected and caring and kind.
Let's talk about the effects on health. You've touched on the subject of mental health and the effects loneliness has on that. And I'd say that aspect of loneliness might be more widely understood. But physically, if you are lonely, you quote some statistics in the book which are frightening. You have a 29% higher risk of coronary heart disease, 32% higher risk of stroke, and a 64% higher risk of developing clinical dementia. That's very, very serious.
Loneliness is as bad for our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And why that is because when we're lonely, what happens is our blood pressure goes up, our cortisol levels, our stress levels in our body go up, our heart rate goes up, our ability to fight infection goes down, inflammation markers in our body go up. All of these, of course, things that are really bad for our health. And when repeated, sustained, have a very, very significant health impact. It's in many ways the biggest public health crisis we're undergoing, and yet it's barely on any politician's radar.
It's frightening when you put it in terms like that. But what are we doing ourselves? Well, let's leave the politicians out of it. I think there's enough on their plate at the minute. But look at the ways in which people try to deal with loneliness themselves to counteract it, if you like. Everything in the book, you've mentioned these. I couldn't believe it when you were talking about Rent a Friend, a website which has over 620,000 friends for hire per hour. And then to the elderly.
Yes, I rented a friend myself, Brittany, for 3 hours. Thought that she was, it was actually forgot at times that I was paying for her until at the end of our 3 hours. She went, as we were in Urban Outfitters trying on Hertz, she went, time's up, that's $120.
That's incredible. Basically, she just told you a nice place to meet and you went for a coffee and then a stroll around the shops like you would do with a good friend. And she was doing this just to get herself through college. She was doing it to get herself through college. I asked her who her usual clients were. She said 30 to 40-year-old professionals, women as well as men, people working long hours, often new to the city, didn't have time to make friends. This was in New York.
Yes, this was in New York.
And that notion of, not having time to make friends and going to events and not wanting to go to events on your own. We were discussing it amongst ourselves as the programme team. We'd be happy to go to the cinema on our own. I would never have dreamt to go to the theatre on my own. People are now renting friends to go to these events with them because there is a stigma with loneliness.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important. I so appreciate your support having me on your show, because it's so important that we destigmatise it and actually say, we all have periods when we're lonely. We've all experienced loneliness. Over half of us are experiencing loneliness on a regular basis. So let's admit that, and then let's work together very consciously on rebuilding the world so that it has community and connection at its heart.
The other example of trying to combat loneliness in the book, which really struck me and I found heartbreaking, to be honest, was the elderly Japanese women who were making a life choice to go to jail. They were committing a crime so that they would be put in jail in order to escape social isolation.
Yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's partly because in Japan, people work such long hours now, and many people have moved to the cities that they've left their elderly parents behind, don't have time to be able to look in on them and care for them. And so their parents, rather than sit on their own, are actually shoplifting and committing minor crimes in order to go to jail.
That's heartbreaking. And so is the story of you've already mentioned the 30 to 40-year-old professionals who find themselves alone because they're working such long hours. Your conversation with Carl really struck a chord with me. This man pays over $2,000 a month just for someone or a number of people to cuddle him because he craves intimacy so much. Now, he's not asking for sex or intercourse of any kind.
No, I was very clear to take.
Yeah, just intimacy.
Yeah, and what I found really staggering, this is a professional, he has a good job, but $2,000 a month for anyone is a lot of money. And I said, how can you afford to pay? And he said, I live in my car. And he showers in the gym, he leaves his food in the fridge at work, he lives in his car so that he can afford to pay people to cuddle him so that he can get the intimacy that he feels he's so missing out on in real life. And, these are strange stories, people who rent friends, people who pay for cuddles. And yet, again, the story is such a widespread one, even if people aren't going to such steps. And if you think just before the pandemic, there was a huge rise in people doing things consciously to be together, go to gigs, go do exercise classes with other people. There was a big rise in what I call the loneliness economy. And that was also just a manifestation of people desperately wanting to be connected to each other. Even in our relationships with our family members or partners, if we have one, we're so bad partly because we're on our phones and we're so distracted that we're just not present with each other.
What do we do going forward? What have you put forward as ways to counter, as you call it, the current trajectory towards loneliness?
There's so much that can be done, so much at a government level, so much at a business level. But I just want to focus perhaps on what we can do as individuals. First, put down our phones and be more present with each other. There's research that shows that even if you are sitting opposite a table with your partner and you have a telephone, smartphone in front of you, even if it's not on or you're not touching it, you feel less connected to each other and less empathetic. So really put your phones down, move them away to the side actually, and be more present with each other. Support your local community. If there's one thing we're all so super aware of now, it's how important our local neighbourhoods are. So now more than ever, shop at your local shops, show up at local community events, initiate a local community event, support a local campaign. And then we can just smile more and say thank you more to others. Value kindness much more, whether it is to your neighbour, your greengrocer, or even to your Alexa. And then reach out to someone in your network who you think might be lonely, particularly now when people are more isolated than ever. Pick up the phone, have a socially distanced meet up with them, but show them that they're not alone, that they are seen, that they're not invisible, and that someone cares.
And the flip side of that, Norina, is if you feel alone, what can you do in order to counteract that?
Well, the tendency when we feel alone is to hunker down, to withdraw even more. That is our natural tendency. So if you are feeling alone right now and you're feeling that is your tendency, don't worry, you're not alone. That is our natural response. But we have to try and fight against it. So is there something, even nowadays, a lot of things have moved to Zoom whilst we can't always do things in person. But do you have an interest? Do you like singing? Do you like music? Do you like cooking? Do you like doing, I go to a weekly improv group. Is there a group activity that speaks to one of your interests that you could perhaps join? Could you volunteer yourself? Could you help other people right now? That's a way of connecting with people where you both get the helper's high, feel less lonely, and help others out. And don't be worried admitting to people in your network, you know what, I'm feeling a bit lonely. You might be surprised at how positive and welcoming the response.
Finding something to combat the loneliness. I suppose that's what we all can try to do. It's really an incredible book with some unbelievable case studies. And just to remind you, the book is called The Lonely Century, Coming Together in a World That's Pulling Apart. And you've just been listening to an interview with the author, Norina Hertz. And the book is published by Scepter.